All right. Hi, everybody. We're just going to give a couple minutes to let folks kind of get in here. So thanks for coming so promptly, and we'll get started in just a minute. Okay, great. All right, I'm going to kick us off. We've got a quorum, I think. So good evening and welcome to tonight's online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm your host, Amy from Greenlight Bookstore, and I'm excited to welcome you to our online event series, Squawkin Sports, hosted by Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. For this installment, they'll be chatting with Theresa Runstedtler about her new book, Black Ball, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Spencer Haywood, and the generation that saved the soul of the NBA. Before we start, I want to say a huge thanks to Theresa, Patrick, and David for making this happen, and to everybody for showing up. Just a couple pieces of housekeeping. The attendees, will be able to see and hear the speakers, but they won't be able to see or hear you. So if you have questions that you want to ask, you just want to click on that little double bubble button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. We will also have the chat open so that you can talk to each other and hopefully buy the book from Greenlight while the event is going on. I will drop in the link to purchase the book into the chat. And I just want to mention as well that we're doing a 10% off deal tonight for attendees. There's a coupon code Greenlight Events 10, which I will also drop in the chat for you. So some intros. Your series hosts for Squawkin Sports are Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. Patrick has written for many large publications you've heard of, and even more small ones that no longer exist. He's a founding member of the Billings, Montana to Brooklyn sports writing pipeline, a vast and massive pipeline, I understand. David was an editor at Deadspin and is now a co-founder and co-owner at Defector.com. His writing has appeared in The New Republic, The New Yorker, Food and Wine, and The Baffler. Tonight, they will be talking with featured author Theresa Runstedtler. Theresa is a scholar of African-American history whose research examines Black popular culture with a particular focus on the intersection of race, masculinity, labor, and sport. She is the author of Jack Johnson, Rebel Sojourner, Boxing in the Shadow of the Global Color Line. Dr. Runstedtler has also published scholarly work in numerous periodicals, as well as contributing book chapters for other texts. She's a professor at American University and lives in Baltimore with her husband and son. In her new book, Black Ball, Theresa provides a vital narrative of 1970s pro basketball and the Black players who shaped the NBA. As Howard Bryant said, the NBA is cool. The story of the Black players who transformed the game into what it is today is even cooler. So you're in for an excellent talk tonight, and I will hand it over to Patrick and David to get started.
We should say former Squawkin Sports guest, Howard Bryant.
Yeah.
So
is that important to mention? That seemed important to mention. All right.
That's everybody went all the circles coming together.
Respect the brand.
We usually start with the reading. So Theresa's going to give us a little taste of Black Ball, which is right here. Great cover.
There we go.
And I will just say off the bat, I think this is the 40th book we've covered, and it is right up there with my favorites that we've done. It's fantastic. Really so let's have a little reading and then we'll get into it.
Great. Well, first off, thank you so much to Patrick and David for inviting me to come, and also the folks at Greenpoint Books for making the book available tonight. And of course, thank you to everybody for actually coming out tonight. I know it's a busy time. It's March Madness. So the fact that you're showing up just warms my heart. So before I actually read a short piece from the book, I just want to say that when I on this project, and I won't tell you how many years ago that was, all of the hoop heads and fellow historians said to me, oh yeah, that was the time when all of the players were on drugs, they were fighting each other on the court and getting into trouble. And I recall seeing various popular tellings of the era, and in those stories, those players, as they were characterized, would have made Ja Morant look like a choir boy in some respects. In fact, I begin the book with Chris Cobbs's infamous 1980 expose on the supposed cocaine crisis in the league. So let me start there and just start things off. All right. So NBA and cocaine, nothing to snort at, declared the Los Angeles Times headline wryly. There are no reliable figures on the use of cocaine by players. Times staff writer Chris Cobbs admitted, quote, but estimates by people in the game range from 40 to 75%, with perhaps as many as 10% getting high with freebase. Obviously, huge range there, right? When that story ran in August 1980, the National Basketball Association, or NBA, appeared to be a league in crisis. And given that around 75% of the league's players were African American, it appeared to be a Black crisis. Cobbs's expose came in the wake of well-publicized drug arrests of several Black players for possession of minor quantities of cocaine. Not only had game attendance and television ratings dipped in recent years, but now professional basketball seemed to be on the verge of a cocaine epidemic. This was a public relations nightmare for a majority Black league that white sports fans already perceived as being violent, criminal, and out of control. Black ball players' use of cocaine, an expensive drug typically associated with white celebrities, jet setters, and professionals, was yet another reminder of their undeserved fortune. At a time when the rest of the United States was still reeling from a decade of stagflation and economic recession, NBA players had become some of the highest paid professional athletes in the world. Many of them, Cobbs noted, came from, quote, unstable families in inner city ghettos and could not seem to handle their sudden wealth. Also, as one anonymous source told Cobbs, quote, the players are so street smart, their sophistication is just below that of a hardened convict. They know every angle on how to get women and drugs. They are so far ahead of the security men, it's unbelievable. They know every hustle. The chaos in the NBA seemed to mirror the chaos, crime, and violence in the streets of American cities. In both cases, young Black men were to blame. And for his reporting, Cobbs won the Investigative Series Award from the Basketball Writers Association of America. Although rife with rumor and speculation, Cobbs's expose has, for the most part, been accepted uncritically as emblematic of the supposed decline of professional basketball throughout the 1970s. As the oft-repeated narrative goes, Black players had brought their immaturity, selfishness, drug abuse, violence, and criminality, a very microcosm of America's urban crisis, to the NBA. They lacked character and morality, and it showed not only in how they conducted themselves off the court, but also in how they played basketball. They had imported their aggressive, flashy, individualistic, and above-the-rim style from the playgrounds of Black neighborhoods to the pro game. A once honorable and disciplined white team, a game of teamwork and set plays, had devolved into anarchy. As African American players came to dominate professional basketball over the course of the 70s, their bad behavior had tarnished its reputation, and their exorbitant salary demands had pushed it to the brink of financial ruin. Now, as I did my research, I found that most journalists and historians tended to just reproduce Cobbs's narrative uncritically without actually ever digging into its larger meanings in the context of 1980. But for me, it sparked so many questions. I wanted to figure out, where did this narrative of this supposedly lazy, selfish, drug-addicted, and even criminal ball player, Black ball player that is, as the source of all of the NBA's troubles come from, and why? Were the 1970s really a terrible period for basketball, a so-called dark age, as folks called it? Because I knew that this was also the moment when pro basketball was becoming both demographically and stylistically Black. And I also, yeah.
I was gonna say
And
that there's two things I want to, two avenues this I want to discuss.
Yeah, sure.
So I think I started reading Sports Illustrated probably around 78, 79. And there's two ways to go with this. So let's take this one first. I'm a Sixers fan. I remember ads for Dr. J. Dave Cowens had ads for Converse in my comic books. I hate the Celtics and Lakers equally. So the NBA being just an open opium den narrative has been pushed for a long time, even into the 90s. Perhaps certain Boston-centric internet writers may have wanted that story told over and over again. Also, to add that Magic and Bird saved the league thing. They go hand in hand. It was just a drug-addled mess, and then two guys came along and I mean, I watched
two guys and David Stern.
Right. So let's talk about, I guess, how ridiculous, the overblown cocaine crisis thing. I mean, Billy Joel had a song literally with the line, a spoon up your nose, that was like a top 10 hit. Cocaine was everywhere, and it wasn't worse in the NBA. So let's just start there. What did you find? And was Cobb the only one? Was it just that story? And then, and then there were arrests. So they just became conventional wisdom during the time? Or was that something later that people were like, oh, that's how it was, we remember?
I feel like when I started doing the research, I actually had started off doing a project on Len Bias, 1986, drafted by the Celtics, who I now know that you don't like.
It's fine. Other people do.
Died of a cocaine overdose, less than 48 hours after being drafted. And all of a sudden he became this, cautionary tale about African-American youth and the dangers of crack cocaine. And that was 1986. And I wanted to figure out, why did that narrative become just so common sense? Why does Ronald Reagan start using it in 1986 to push in?
Yeah, an avatar for actual punitive 3 strikes you're out, weight.
Well, the 3 strikes comes later, but yeah, absolutely. This punitive turn in drug policing, and really the moment when mass incarceration goes up. So I literally went into the newspaper databases and typed in NBA and cocaine, and I just wanted to see what would come up. And holy, a lot of articles came up. And Chris Cobb's was the most famous article from 1980. I think it's the kind of racial touchstone that folks turn to when they're talking about the late 1970s and the NBA's supposed decline. But there were actually stories going all the way back into the early 70s where you would get a report in a newspaper about some NBA player, and it, without fail was always a Black player getting caught for a minor possession or getting arrested for minor cocaine possession. A lot of these incidents never actually, were converted into any charges or convictions. Often it was something where the amount of cocaine was too small to even sort of register as being something worthy of policing. And then, sometimes it turned out that the evidence was actually procured in nefarious ways, or there just wasn't enough evidence to actually convict them. So I was just trying to figure out, what is this discussion surrounding drugs? Why are African-American players the ones that become the center of the moral panic? And let me be clear, I'm not saying that nobody was using cocaine in the NBA. I mean, like you said at the beginning,
it's like everybody was using cocaine everywhere including the NBA. Yeah.
Right. So but the fact that they were Black, that they were young, that they were often associated with the quote unquote inner city, the urban crisis of the 1970s, that was problematic for the league. And so they went to all sorts of lengths to try and demonstrate to white fans and white sports writers that they had things under control. And so they did all sorts of more so PR related things to make the league look like it was quote unquote anti-drug. And so I just, again, I'm not saying that nobody was doing drugs, but it was clearly a racialized narrative. And I think part of a wider backlash in the late 70s against the growing dominance of African American players in the league, and also the growing, freedom and power of African Americans writ large in American society. After all, this is like the first decade after the passage of civil rights legislation. This is the moment when, racial integration becomes part of the practice of trying to make those deferred dreams a reality. And so people are talking about that process through Black ball players because they're so visible, they're so highly paid, and they're easy to target.
Yeah, that's the part of it. It's the targeting bit that I think really struck me, because it's a thread that runs through the book. And this book covers, more than a decade of, that it's basically ending at the, doorstep of the 1980s. And we're starting with Spencer Haywood and some of the really early cases of like people just being like basically blackballed from the league because they did not fit with, the NBA's preferred practices, and then also sort of its image for itself. But the way that drugs are sort of instrumentalized as part of that story is like really interesting, because there's this, by the time you get to the end of it, it is the idea of, it's like Reaganite, the idea of, that this is a country in crisis. It's a war zone. The players are out there fighting each other all the time. It's not safe, and it's not, suitable for families, which is all the sort of rhetoric that was used about cities at that time. But what was interesting about, and you mentioned about how some of these drug charges were like not necessarily trumped up necessarily, but utilized. I was wondering if you could tell people about the case of Wally Jones. That's a name that I knew a little bit just from like,
Okay.
I probably found a basketball card of his for $1 in a store when I was a kid. And I was fascinated by like the ways that the word anti-drug can be used, because he could have been described as an anti-drug activist. And yet the way that the league tried to sort of get over on him because he was a disagreeable guy was also steeped in a very different vision of like how anti-drug policy could be talked about or used.
Yeah, I mean the NBA at that time really wanted anything anti-drug to, not have any political message along with it, right? And I think that was sort of one of the cardinal sins of Wally Jones, is that from the get-go, even during his time with the 76ers, I pick him up when he gets traded to the Milwaukee Bucks. But even during his time with the Philadelphia 76ers, he talked about the fact that he would always get stopped by the police. These guys were getting DWBs. They were young guys who, had a physical presence, who were well known, and who drove nice cars. And he even called the Philadelphia police at one point the Gestapo. Like he was like, he was very critical of hyper policing. The other thing that he was very critical of right from the get-go of his career in the NBA was the fact that, he was somebody who grew up in quote unquote an inner city neighborhood in Philadelphia. He had seen drug usage, he had seen violence, but instead of blaming folks for their own troubles, and that was, it still is a narrative today, blaming Black people for the ills of poverty. We like to blame people for their own misfortune. He said, look, a lot of these kids have nothing to do after school. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the rest of US society has actually abandoned the quote unquote inner city. And that's when these kids, and many of them strive to be athletes, that's when they are vulnerable to things like violence, gang activity, and drugs. And so he established an organization called Concerned Athletes in Action that actually went about doing a little bit of community organizing, doing anti-drug clinics, trying to provide after-school or basketball clinics for young folks, and give them an outlet for all of the energy that they had. And they really tried to step into the breach where the government had basically disinvested from those parts of the city. And he says all of this, all of the things that I'm describing, he actually said in a Senate subcommittee meeting or an investigation into the quote unquote proper and improper use of drugs in sports. And he says, look, this is what the real problem is. He was actually there to talk about the actual panel itself, or investigative hearings, were supposed to be about the use of performance enhancing drugs in sports. And they brought Wally Jones in, and he ends up going off about the fact that, look, this is the real drug problem. It's created by structural racism and poverty. Now, the reason why he came on the radar of the Senate investigations, which were chaired by Senator Birch Bayh, was because he had actually gotten caught up, ironically, in his own cocaine scandal. And he was convinced that it was the Milwaukee Bucks who were trying to essentially invalidate his contract by, feeding into rumors that he was using cocaine.
I mean, the way that you describe the case, it's not like, this isn't the sort of thing where sometimes a cyclist gets caught with a bunch of steroids in them and they're like, I ate a hot dog that had steroids in it. This is while he's at practice, yes, 2 private detectives from the team, correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong, it's just 2 private detectives hired by the team go into his room, claim to find cocaine there. The team suspends him for claiming that he had lost weight and strength, which he had not. Mm-hmm. And then weeks later, the private investigators turn the cocaine over to the police and are like, we found this in the backup point guard's room at his hotel, by the way.
Even worse, they didn't turn it over to the police. They brought it to, supposedly there had been a little bit of cocaine in his pants. They brought the evidence 2 weeks later to an independent lab. Somebody who was moonlighting right from the police, yep, to check it. And then they brought that report to the police and said, look, here's the smoking gun. He's been using cocaine. And, he did not lie down and sort of take it. He went back to Philadelphia. He had an attorney who arranged for him to have a physical by reputable doctors in the Philadelphia area to show that he had not lost stamina. The Bucks had said that he had. And they still suspended him. And then they ended up putting him on waivers. And because there were so many rumors swirling around him, because initially they didn't even say that it was about drugs. They just said, he's lost weight and stamina. But in the context of the 1970s, and given what Wally Jones had publicly said about himself being from the inner city, he's kind of like a Black Power guy. He had a big bushy afro. He wore Black Power armbands. The next step, the logical leap that most folks took was that, oh, this guy must be on drugs. Right.
It's like they put him on the injured reserve with nosebleeds, yeah, and then they winked at you really dramatically. Exactly. This is something that, for me, as somebody who did not read about the NBA obsessively as a kid because I loved it, but it was, I grew up in the 80s and 90s. This was all fairly recent history, but it had that kind of, the way that people talked about the 70s in the 80s and 90s basically made it sound to me as a kid like they were talking about the 1880s. Like everything was so bizarre and overstated. And yet it was presented as a kind of a picaresque, like especially with the ABA, where they were like, oh, it is, teams are moving all the time. The owners didn't have any money. All the players were they wore leisure suits while they were playing. Everybody's on drugs, whatever. And it was all kind of cartoonish. And then to actually read the incidents in this book, I found there's a lot of stuff in here that I thought I knew about, and I think I probably knew the broad strokes of. And yet there is so much more of the kind of administrative rat fuckery and ownership misbehavior and all of this other contextualizing stuff that was this was not actually a circus. There was a lot of people whose livelihoods were getting screwed up systematically in a league that didn't really seem to have any rules or self-governance beyond whatever you could get away with as an owner.
But also there's the quote, and this just lays out what people will believe, white people, that article, the infamous cocaine crisis, 75% of the league is on drugs. Julius Erving said, basically, my man, Dr. J, basically said, that's insane. Just take 5 seconds to think of if 75% of players in this league are hardcore cocaine addicts, probably the league probably isn't functioning as a thing where they actually play games every night. And it's just that kind of, the story that is told is insane. There were guys playing basketball every night, just 14 guys on a team, maybe one of them dabbled, it's just, that just defies common sense, but that became the story.
Yeah, and I think it was Dr. J who also said, look, if you really want to find where the problem is, it's alcohol. It's actually not cocaine. Yeah. And this was, an open secret in all of the North American sports leagues that alcohol was available, was being, abused or used heavily by especially coaches. I think somebody even called out the coaches for their use of alcohol. And yet the NBA at that time, in the initial moments when, this cocaine crisis started ramping up, they were so blinded by their own sort of racialized narratives that they were like, no, cocaine isn't, alcohol isn't a problem. They have to be up. They have to be energetic in order to play well. So clearly they're not using alcohol. They must be using cocaine. And so, there were all sorts of moments, like getting back to what David was saying earlier, where I looked into the history. I'd always heard that the ABA was the Black League, and that, that was its claim to fame. And on the one hand, that is true in the sense that the ABA opening up as a rival league to the NBA gave Black players the opportunity to actually get onto squads where previously the NBA had either blacklisted them or they, were not able to get into the NBA because of the informal racial quota. So it did open a door for them, and it also opened the door to Black playing style. But if you look at the records of the ABA and the kind of message that they were trying to send out initially in their marketing materials, Rick Barry was their guy.
Yep.
They wanted it to be, in the same vein as the NBA. They had no desire to actually transgress racial mores or
and everybody liked Rick Barry. That was the thing.
I was gonna say, not just a white guy, by wide acclaim, the most obnoxious white man ever to play basketball.
Literally, people still bitch about him,
and people still were giving him endorsements. They were having him show up at their celebrity golf games and whatnot. And on the flip side, you had somebody like Connie Hawkins, who was unjustly accused of being involved in a gambling scandal in college ball, blacklisted or kicked out of the NCAA, blacklisted by the NBA, even had to lower himself to play with the Globetrotters and some semi-professional teams. And he, just for having the taint of possibly being a part of that gambling scandal, has his career nearly destroyed. And yet Rick Barry, when he jumps from the NBA to the ABA and, basically flouts the reserve clause of the NBA, people had some things to say. Maybe they were disgruntled about it, but his career just went on.
Yeah.
And Connie Hawkins, you should add Connie Hawkins. Everybody who was convicted in that gambling scandal was white. I mean, St. Joe's had to basically half their team went to, or kicked off the team. In talking about drug addiction, I want to talk about one guy who is Spencer Haywood. I knew the hardship story, and I had known he had a problem. And then in Winning Time, the HBO not documentary, HBO series.
What's the opposite of documentary?
I don't think it was documentary.
They made it a central figure in a way that I don't think he probably was to that team. And it seemed like a convenient thing to hang a lot of drama on. So let's give Spencer a few minutes, because he was a take no shit activist in between the hardship and the Winning Time portrayal. He did a bunch of stuff that I did not know about, basically took on the owners and said, pay me what I earned. Right. And so tell us a little bit about Spencer Haywood, who I think has
so
gotten
Spencer
short shrift.
Haywood, absolutely. And Spencer Haywood, he's finally getting his due. There was another book by Mark Spears that recently came out as well that traces his entire life story. But what I found with Spencer Haywood, and I had known about the fact that he was, or that his case, Hawkins v. the NBA, helped to strike down the 4-year rule. The 4-year rule was an NBA rule at that time. It was in their bylaws, which basically stated that any player must have been 4 years removed from their high school graduation in order to enter the college draft. And essentially, it was a gentleman's agreement between the NBA and the NCAA to help maintain the free farm system that the NCAA is for the NBA. And basically, the NBA said, we won't touch your players as long as you prepare them, and we will, take those that we want into our draft. So Spencer Haywood, what I didn't know was that when he was playing at the University of Detroit, was their star player. He was disgruntled after his treatment at the University of Detroit. He had been promised some things, including the fact that his mentor would take over as coach once the coach that he started with had retired or moved on, and that didn't happen. So he felt that they had broken a promise to him, and they brought in this real hard-ass coach.
This guy
Hardy.
is such a great little character in the book, because he keeps popping up. He follows Spencer Haywood around, tormenting him for like half a decade.
Well, and the fact that this guy who had this reputation for being openly racist against Black players and treating them with absolute contempt kept on getting job after job.
Yes.
Right. And he even had some NCAA violations. And somehow he continues on and he keeps getting a job. But Spencer Haywood then said, okay, the ABA is now established. His mentor told him, look, there's a talent war going on between the NBA and the ABA. You need to take advantage of this. Let's see if the ABA, will give you a contract. So the ABA did something that was, really, really clever. They created this thing called the hardship clause, which basically stated that if a player had a demonstrated financial need, they could forego or bypass the 4-year rule and be drafted as an underclassman. So essentially, they were able to get the college talent before they became eligible for the NBA draft. And that's how the Denver Rockets of the ABA ended up signing Spencer Haywood for reputedly $1 million contract. But what Spencer Haywood found out was that actually it wasn't $1 million contract. So much of the compensation was deferred. So much of it was unguaranteed. And he had to give so much extra service to the team to actually be able to collect even what was in the contract. And so he ended up getting an agent to represent him, which was another transgression of the typical kind of situation with the owners where players would often go in without any legal representation and try to negotiate with the owners. His agent tells him, look, forget about the Rockets. Let's see if Sam Schulman of the Seattle Supersonics will give you a contract. And Schulman gave him a contract, a much better, more transparent contract than he had with the Rockets. But the kicker was the NBA was pissed because they had essentially bypassed the 4-year rule, bypassed the college draft. And that was, from their point of view, essential to maintaining the salary structure. Because if anyone could sort of show up before the college draft, before their 4 years were up past college graduation, then this meant that it was going to be more of an open market for players to shop their services to different teams. And they didn't want that happening.
But Haywood was out front on this. He took a lot of bullets for
he was the first guy
demanding what
who really did this. And so he ends up suing the NBA. And the courts eventually agreed with his position. They said that this is a breach of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The NBA is acting like a monopoly because they're engaging in a group boycott against anyone who hasn't, surpassed the 4 years outside of high school. So that 4-year rule got struck down as illegal. He ended up on the Seattle Supersonics. But of course, he got dragged through the mud because he took that stand. And one of the things that he said later on when he was going through his own personal problems with his own cocaine problem, which incidentally was never really talked about in the press, he said that he couldn't help but think that even though within the NBA his cocaine use was an open secret, that the NBA officials and team officials, kind of enjoyed watching his downfall because of the stand that he had taken earlier in the decade. And so they weren't really apt to actually help him out.
This is something that runs all through the book. I think it's one of the things that I found most interesting about it, because I think, so that story is in microcosm, like sort of, well, it's not like repeated exactly, microcosmically. There's all these, everybody gets screwed over in different ways. That's kind of the fun of the book. But there is the way that you talk about the way that race sort of works in this, that the league over the time, and basketball in general that you cover, becomes more aesthetically and kind of culturally Black. While in terms of power, this is the real sort of tension in it, is like not just like white in a way that like power in the United States tends to be white, but like gatekeeping that power in ways big and small, petty, incredibly petty. In the case of, you write about Simon Gordine, who became very close to being the commissioner of the NBA, but couldn't quite make it, in large part because he was a Black man. That like all of that stuff, that dynamic of like, the sort of the performance aspect that made the league, eventually made it more popular, butting up against the sort of the way that power functions and how little there is to sort of yield there. And so many of the conflicts are, as you said, in the case of Spencer Haywood, but then, like for Connie Hawkins as well, over and over, it's through the courts, it's through like, and they have to fight tooth and nail for all of this stuff. And so much of the perspective that I had as a fan of the game as a kid, all of these things that I sort of took for granted and understood, even, down to free agency, but even going back to, players, the right to like not play for the team that drafted you or something like that. is like not just like newer, but I don't think it's generally understood how hard won all of that stuff was.
Yeah, and I think that there's a reason for that. I think that, and the NBA is not singular in this. Of course, all of the professional sports like to cast themselves as humanitarian purveyors of, fun for the public,
Right. But the NBA
And
is the
also,
one that like
yeah,
acts like it has a politics more than the other ones do, I think.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And so the narrative, and when I first started doing this project, folks would always say to me, but the NBA is the most progressive league that there is. And I said, well, it is, but the bar, how
Right.
low is the bar?
What is the deepest puddle that you have ever encountered in your life?
If we're comparing it to the NFL,
WNBA,
right.
the WNBA now exists, so they have to claim the mantle by
absolutely. And I
have
think
to
the
throw them
NBA
in.
has actually taken a page from the WNBA and its rising success and has realized that they better get on the train and start riding it, and they have to toe a much more careful line in this day and age because of the sheer power of the NBPA and their ability to have unmediated access to their fans through social media and other forms of communication. So, one of the things that I keep hammering home again and again is that if the NBA has become more progressive in the way that it treats its players in terms of their pensions, their guaranteed contracts, etc., it's because the players made it so.
Yep.
If they are more willing, in the case of Commissioner Silver saying, listen, during all of the BLM protests in the bubble, he was right out there in front saying, we are going to support our players' right to free speech. Well, I don't think that if the players' union wasn't as strong as it is, that they would be so quick to make these declarations. And I think also too, much like the WNBA, because the players have a certain kind of political cachet, because they are so closely associated with, African American politics and culture, the fans have followed them there, right? So to clamp down on them in the exact same way, and you can even see this with the case of Ja Morant, they can't come out and say, oh, look at this guy, he's a thug, we're going to clean it up. That can't be the narrative anymore. And it just shows, I think, how far the players have pushed them and how much power the players have and how much the fans, I think the fan base of the NBA has shifted over time from what it was in the 70s.
I was thinking about that too. Maybe, outside of, I don't know, possibly Indiana, where fan base,
yeah.
It really is different. And the whole kind of red state, blue state thing that, we sometimes like to pretend like, well, it's not so straitiated, but I don't know, it kind of is. The NBA has been moving that way. And I was thinking that in reading the book. So I get in the 70s, it was like a white dude could go to a game for $5. And that was like 2/3 of fan bases everywhere. And, outside of maybe the Garden, which people talk about a very African-American driven team, there's the beloved early Knicks. But yeah, so I guess the fan base thing was a totally different than it would be now, the cost of a ticket, whatever. But it does feel like
it's a global property
for sure
too, which has also changed things. I mean, the US always likes to look like it's the leader of the free world, right? So these moments of clamping down on players in a racist fashion are now not only being projected within the United States, they're being projected all over the world. So it takes on a different kind of significance, I think, in the 21st century.
Yeah. And seeing it did
perhaps in the 70s.
Yeah. And seeing in the 70s with the book, the way that it reflects, because it was a smaller league, and like in a lot of ways like a rinky-dink league. Like there's a bit in here that you mentioned, which I think I may have already known, that like it's like the 75 NBA finals, like basically the Warriors couldn't play at home because the fucking ice capades were happening, and they were like, sorry guys, they're a much bigger draw. Like you got to go to the
be a
community
figure
center.
skater, so now watch.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. My wife was too. Some of my best friends are in the ice capades, but I think what's funny about all of that is like that sort of that shabby, like sort of like not like down market, but I mean just the way that things were in the 70s, that like the global brand thing does like sort of project this like seamlessness in the way that like international corporate entities tend to. Whereas in this case, it's like it's all the resentment politics, all of the sort of labor politics, and the way, I mean, you do a very good job of pulling this out in the book. I mean, in the way that the Players Association is basically the advocate for not just like the people working in the league, but like it's the only voice for Black people within the NBA, and they instantly understood it as such. But the way that the United States understood working people and bosses, labor versus management, people getting paid versus like resentment of other people getting paid because you think that money's not coming from you, it's all playing out, like all of the stuff that defined the politics of that decade, and then would go on to, I mean, still do, I think, in a lot of ways define the basic.
It's still busing.
Dynamic.
It's always busing. We've never gotten over busing.
Buzzing, and you know,
well,
like
and of
some
course,
other guy
busing is, you know, a euphemism for
integration,
protests against integration.
Yeah, my wife was bused to a magnet school in Tulsa, downtown Tulsa, and I was like, "So you took a bus?" She's, "Well, yeah, I mean, sometimes we took a bus." Oh, so the bus, there's not even actually a physical bus. A bus was not involved in this even.
Right.
This is true, and I do. You mentioned his name. Let's do a few minutes on Simon Gordine, because that is a name I had never come across. We talked about him a little bit before we came on air, and a guy who probably should have been commissioner, was definitely there, but just enlighten us on a man that definitely deserves to be known, and they should at least have a trophy or something named after him at this point.
Yeah, I mean, Simon Gordine, and he was with the league for a long time, even after the end of the book. So I think for folks who are part of the NBA, they probably have more of a knowledge of him than folks who, you know, aren't attuned to the inner workings of the league. But he was somebody who he eventually became the deputy commissioner of the NBA, working under Walter Kennedy in I think it was 1974. And he was slated to potentially become the next commissioner. At least, certainly the Black press was very hopeful. A lot of Black sports writers were saying, "Oh, this is a shoo-in. He's, you know, the mentee of Kennedy himself." But then he got passed over for Larry O'Brien, who has a trophy named after him, and in large part because of his political connections in DC, as the league was still fighting to get an antitrust waiver so that they could merge with the ABA. But Gordine's story is so interesting because he's this unsung guy who became the highest ranking African American in professional sports administration in all of North America. And, you know, again, somebody who's not really talked about. His story was particularly unique because he wasn't a former player. So we understand the pipeline of a Bill Russell becoming coach, of a Wayne Embry becoming the first Black GM in the league, or Al Attles and Casey Jones, former players, becoming coaches. That made sense in the context of the late 60s and into the 70s. But Gordine was kind of an outlier because he was a guy who, you know, went to university, ended up going to law school. He worked in corporate law for a while. He knew about antitrust law, which was one of the main reasons why Kennedy brought him on. And then he just worked in I mean, I guess the shadow of Walter Kennedy, carrying out all of the administrative tasks, being the liaison for between the league and the Players Association. And he was a trained attorney. But for him, he understood his position as being one where he, by virtue of his positioning in the inner sanctum of power of the NBA, that he could actually attempt to change things from the inside. But he was kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand, he was this, African American man who understood racial politics at the time. But on the other hand, he was also the mouthpiece of the league. And so those two things sometimes clashed.
But
And he was,
I think I want to read this quote from him, because this is where you're walking both lines without, company man, but you also don't want to be a total yes man to the company.
Right.
And he says, I'm a black man, but I wouldn't be a black man's commissioner. If anyone infers that I would reject all claims of white players and accept all the claims of black players, that's absurd. But I have a black perspective, and I guess a white man has a white man's perspective. Perfect.
Yeah, he's like,
yeah.
Well, he's very similar to a lot of the black mayors of the same time period, where they had to walk this very tight line between identifying with the folks who voted them into power, while also recognizing that they couldn't openly say that they were going to do things in favor of African Americans. So to me, he's emblematic of the growing black middle class, the growing black middle class administrative class in the United States, and their kind of conflicts with, the goals of civil rights, whether it was in the boardroom or in metropolitan areas.
I'm going to read the Q&A question real quick. I think Dave was having a sound issue. And then
I was wondering if it was on my end, but okay.
We will get back to, there's something I want to ask you. We'll do the Q&A question first. From Ronald Balter. This is interesting, actually. Do you think Spencer Haywood becomes who he is in basketball history and his role in your book if Abdul-Jabbar and a number of other top African-American players went to the Olympics in '68? One of the things I remember is that he came out of nowhere to be the star of the '68 Olympic team, and that's how he became known to the basketball world.
Yeah, absolutely. The irony about Spencer Haywood, ironies of all ironies, is that he went to the Mexico Olympics, which of course there was a lot of activism in the late 60s about, poor working conditions, poor treatment of African-American athletes at both the college, the professional, and also the international level. And so all of that led to the movement to boycott the '68 Olympics, or at least the attempt to organize a boycott of the '68 Olympics. And the boycott didn't actually go through, but individual players like Kareem, and I think it was Unseld, and I'm forgetting the third guy. There's so many names to remember. The preeminent centers of the time chose not to go to the Olympics. Kareem actually said, I'm not going to go represent a country that discriminates against my people. He made that very clear. So Spencer Haywood ends up becoming this huge star at the Mexico Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
And ironically, he seemed like the ultimate safe pick. If you were going to take somebody out of college, you picked the guy who went to the '68 Olympics and didn't do any kind of protest on the podium. But of course, the context that I try to add for that is that Spencer Haywood was not that far removed from picking cotton in Mississippi. And, he realized that he kind of had to really have tunnel vision and think about the risks involved in taking a kind of political stand at that point. He later regretted and actually supported the boycott movement once he, was a bit older and had more perspective and had seen the fallout that happened after Carlos and Smith did their podium protest. But that really catapults him into the limelight and sort of sets him on the path. But what they didn't expect was the fact that he was also somebody who was just not going to take any contract, and that he had his own reasons for fighting back against the power, even if he didn't have exactly the same politics as the likes of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar back in '68.
Can we, we're working backwards here, but I could talk about this book for hours, but we're coming close to the end. But I do have to ask.
It's okay.
The origin story of this book.
Yes.
You are a very singular person in one respect. Tell us the origin story, because I find that endlessly fascinating.
Like in terms of my personal connection to the NBA?
Yes, how it began.
Yes, yeah. I used to be really cagey about this story because I wanted to be respected, like, an academic, but now I don't care.
The book's out. You've got this, your second book.
Well, no, but I also have, like, no more F's to give about that. And I also I actually really do, upon reflection, see that time that I spent, working as a dancer, because I didn't just, so I worked as a Toronto Raptors dance pack member back in the late 90s. Now I think they're called the North Side Crew. So I joined the team. I was with them for 3 seasons. My last season was a season of the lockout and the first season of Vince Carter. So that sort of tells you what era we're talking about. But even then, I was, kind of a quiet person. I like to observe, and I was a university student at that time. I was somebody who was interested in history and interested in sociology. And so I just observed that, even from the vantage point of a dancer, there were things that were going on in terms of how we were managed. And how we were made to sort of fit a certain kind of mold that spoke to the larger racial dynamics of the league itself. So when we started out, Isaiah Thomas, for whatever you have to say about him as a GM, was very good to the dance team.
Yeah, there's no Knicks fans here, so you can, everybody's fine, whatever. It's Isaiah Thomas. Maybe his
man has a job again. The man is working again. Thank goodness.
I have nothing but great things to say about his belief in allowing the dance team to really reflect, I think, the spirit of the team, the players, and youth culture at that time, particularly hip hop culture. So when we first started out, we had mechanic suits, we had the bandanas, this is the late 90s, mid to late 90s. We danced to Busta Rhymes, and by the time the team became more corporatized and was bought by Maple Leaf Sport and Entertainment, which at that time also owned the Toronto Maple Leafs. Of course, Toronto's a hockey town. Canada's a hockey country. So basketball was sort of like a minor player in all of that. And then we moved to what was then the Air Canada Centre, which was the new arena. And all of a sudden, it just seemed like we started dancing to Motown. Like we started dancing to Will Smith, and things just got cleaned up. It's got a lot tighter, and the sort of character of the team in terms of, the shapes, colors, sizes of folks who were on the team seemed to become much more streamlined to what you would imagine as the typical look of kind of an NBA dance team. So even in that, I could sort of see, we are marketing the team and we are there to entertain the folks on the floor. the folks in the boxes, the corporate folks, the white guys with a lot of money who sit on the floor. We're not here to really be appealing, to the folks in the nosebleeds anymore. And so I at the time, I didn't really understand what I was seeing, but upon reflection, I'm like, ooh, okay, this sort of fits with also what was happening to folks like Allen Iverson and others who, insisted on dressing the way that they wanted to dress, getting the tats, like being a part of hip hop culture. And, the NBA tried to put guardrails around that, particularly after the Malice at the Palace, when the fight broke out between players and fans. Then you started seeing all sorts of things like a dress code, et cetera. So for me, I just couldn't help but think, as I dug into this history a little bit more, that what I was seeing in the 70s was really creating the kind of foundation for the league's response to Blackness in subsequent decades. And I witnessed it firsthand.
This is the thing that's great about reading any sufficiently nuanced and insightful bit of history, which the book very much is that you realize that none of this ever got solved or even necessarily addressed.
Well, there's a détente. I think we can say we're in the era of the Pax NBA, right? There is a détente. There's a truce. I think especially after the salary cap and players were able to get a percentage of the total revenue, and free agency came into being. I think that there has been a sort of, truth, but those politics are never really that far from the surface. They can activate at any time.
Not just in the NBA either. Feels amazing. Yeah. I love it.
I think it's important. We've just completely debunked the magic bird myth. That no longer.
Out of here.
So we have to wrap up, unfortunately. Once again, Blackball. Very, very good. Get yourself smarter. We have one announcement. Our next show is going to be live again. That is at DSK Beer Garden in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, where we'll be talking baseball with Evan Drelich. Is that how you say that, Dave? Drelich?
I think it's a hard CH.
Drelich. His book is Winning Fixes Everything. That is the story of the McKinsey efficiency-driven cheating-ass Astros and their fake World Series that they stole. And Chris Donnelly, who has a book called Road to Nowhere about the very fallow mid-'80s to mid-'90s New York Yankees and New York Mets teams that nobody remembers. So that'll be live. And then, I don't know when we'll be back on Zoom. We'll figure that out. But, enjoy the tournaments. Go Marquette. Pick up Blackball. Read it in commercial breaks. And the book is great. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks so much. This was an absolute pleasure.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. I was very worried as a soccer fan, but this was thrilling. Thank you. Those workouts are no joke, Theresa. My old coach was a Brooklynette, and God. Anyway, thanks y'all so much for your time, and hopefully we'll see you all at the live event. Bye. Have a good night.
Go Marquette.
Calm down.
Thanks.